Question 57 of Prima Secunda of the Summa Theologia is on the intellectual virtues. The virtues are habits, and the good habits are virtues. And so these are focusing on the habits that help to improve our intellect, which is the higher part of our soul. Of course, you have the sensitive appetites down below, and the mind, or the higher part, it would be the intellect and the will. And so this has to do with how we perfect that and direct it to the good ultimately, which is a very important part of the Christian life for sure. There's 6 articles in this question, and the first one says whether the habits of the speculative intellect are virtues. And so what is speculative intellect? Well, there's 2 parts of the intellect. There's the speculative intellect, and then there's the operative. And the speculative intellect has to do with the contemplation of truth. All right, so we have truth all around us, and how do we contemplate it? How do we come to know it and understand it? That's what the speculative intellect has to do with. And operative, as we'll talk about as well, has more to do with outward actions, or even inward actions in a sense, with the virtue of prudence, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So he says here, the habits of the speculative intellect do not perfect the appetitive part. Okay, appetite means desire. Nor affected in any way, but only the intellective part, which has to do with apprehension, right? We come to know things through our intellect. They may indeed be called virtues insofar as they confer aptness for a good work, that is, the consideration of truth. Yet they are not called virtues in the second way, as though they conferred the right use of a power or a habit. All right, so this is an interesting distinction here. For if a man possess a habit of speculative science, it does not follow that he is inclined to make use of it, but he is made able to consider the truth in those matters of which he has a scientific knowledge. So this is an important distinction, is that the speculative part of the soul doesn't have to do with doing anything. It has to do with knowledge. It has to do with contemplation. It's what we keep inside us, but then as you'll see, we're going to use that knowledge in order to go out and do the right thing and do good through other parts, through other virtues. That he makes use of a knowledge which he has is due to the motion of his will. Now, this is an interesting part of the Summa, is that the whole relationship between intellect and will, and how does one move the other and vice versa. This is something that St. Thomas Aquinas is very interested in, because, of course, God is intellect, God is will, and with God, intellect and will are the same thing. It's only from our perspective that they seem different in God, because God is. He is in his simplicity, it's all the same, right? Consequently, a virtue which perfects the will, as charity or justice, confers the right use of these speculative habits. And in this way, too, there can be merit in the acts of these habits if they are done out of charity. And so that is a classic example of Thomas explaining relationship between the intellect and the will, and how virtue is applied to that relationship. Article 2 says whether there are only 3 habits of the speculative intellect, that is, wisdom, science, and understanding. All right, so these are the 3 habits or virtues of the speculative intellect, which has to do with the contemplation of truth. He says the virtues of the speculative intellect are those which perfect the speculative intellect for the consideration of truth. Now, a truth is subject to a twofold consideration, as known in itself and as known through another. What is known in itself is a principle, and it is at once understood by the intellect, wherefore the habit that perfects the intellect for the consideration of such truth is called understanding. All right, so understanding is the virtue of understanding first principles, right? So this would be the basic truths that are proposed to us, and if you assent to them and you understand them, and don't just there's a difference between knowledge and understanding, right? And so this is an intellectual virtue. And then he says, on the other hand, a truth which is known through another is understood by the intellect, not at once, but by means of the reason's inquiry. Okay, so it takes a little bit more work. Wisdom, which considers the highest causes, as stated by Aristotle, okay, wherefore it rightly judges all things and sets them in order, because there can be no perfect and universal judgment that is not based on first causes. All right, so you may know somebody that you consider wise. They typically can see things from a high level and not get too worked up about little things that happen to them, little disappointments or frustrations. They're able to kind of see the big picture, almost like they're seeing it from God's perspective. And God sees all things in a single moment and sees the big picture, right? And all right, but in regard to that which is last in this or that genus of knowable matter, it is science which perfects the intellect. Wherefore, according to the different kinds of knowable matter, there are different habits of scientific knowledge. All right, so when it comes to matter and the things in the world, it's science. When it comes to understanding first principles, well, you have understanding, and then the ordering things and kind of having an understanding of causes, especially first causes, would be where wisdom comes in. All right, is art an intellectual virtue? Is art an intellectual virtue? He says, art is nothing but the right reason about certain works to be made, and yet the good of these things depends not on man's appetitive faculty being affected in this way or that, but on the goodness of the work done. For a craftsman as such is commendable not for the will with which he does a work, but for the quality of the work. And therefore, properly speaking, it is an operative habit. And so art has the nature of a virtue in the same way as these speculative habits. All right. So art is one of the intellectual virtues, but it is a operative. Okay. So we had wisdom, we had understanding, and we had science as speculative virtues of the intellect, which contemplate truth. And now we're going to have two operative ones. One of them is going to be art, and the second one is prudence. All right. Article 4 is prudence distinct from art. He says art is the right reason of things to be made, whereas prudence is the right reason of things to be done. Now, making and doing differ. Is that art passes out to outward matter, that is, to build, to saw, and so forth, whereas doing is an action abiding within the agent, to see, to will, to like. Perfection and rectitude of reason in speculative matters depends on the principles from which reason argues. Science depends on and presupposes understanding, which is the habit of principles. Now, in human acts, the end is what the principles are in speculative matters. Consequently, it is requisite for prudence, which is right reason about things to be done, that man be well disposed with regard to the ends. All right, so what we're going to find is that with prudence, there is going to be working with a moral virtue, okay, as we're going to see in this next one. He says whether prudence is a virtue necessary to man, okay, is it necessary? And he says, yes, prudence is a virtue most necessary to human life, and since choice about things is reference to the end, rectitude of choice requires two things, namely the due end and something suitably ordained to that due end. Now, man is suitably directed to his due end by a virtue which perfects the soul in the appetitive part, the object of which is the good and the end, and to that which is suitably ordained to the due end, man needs to be rightly disposed by a habit of his reason. So let's say you go to work and somebody brings donuts in, and they've got all these donuts in a box there, and you have to make a decision on how many you're going to eat. Well, the appetite is the lower part of the soul, okay? So that's saying, eat 4 or 5 of them. And so temperance is the moral virtue that comes in and says, I don't think so. I think you probably ought to have 1 or 2. So what is needed is an intellectual virtue of prudence that comes in and commands what you're going to do, as we're going to find in this next and last article. And this one is Eubulia, Synesis, and Gnome are virtues annexed to prudence. So I guess there really aren't any English translations to this, and that's why I got this lady like, what the heck is this? Okay, so these are clearly, it looks like Greek words. And so he says, there are 3 acts of reason in respect of anything done by man. The first of these is counsel, the second judgment, and the third command. The first 2 correspond to those acts of the speculative intellect, okay? So counsel and judgment have to do with contemplation of truth, understanding, wisdom, science, and which are inquiry and judgment. For counsel is a kind of inquiry, but the third is proper to the practical intellect insofar as this is ordained to operation. So you see how it all comes together. We need speculative virtues of the speculative intellect, and we need virtues of the operative, or the action intellect, like prudence and art, coming together and helping out. But what he's going to say here is it is evident that in things done by man, the chief act is that of command. Okay, that ties into prudence, to which all the rest are subordinate. Consequently, that virtue which perfects the command, prudence, is obtained as obtaining the highest place, has other secondary virtues annexed to it, abulia, which perfects counsel, and synesis and nome, which are parts of prudence in relation to judgment, and of those distinction we shall speak further on. All right, so you can see that there's a lot of different kinds of virtues, and then there's like subordinate virtues that are supporting the other virtues. But the key is that the virtues are habits that make us good, and God is goodness itself. And so the more virtuous we are, the more we are like unto God. And these also, by the way, are acquired virtues. They can be infused, because any virtue can be infused by God, but these are acquired virtues. So this is something that we can work on. We can try to be more prudent, or we can try to be more wise, or have greater understanding by a life of conformity to God, and also practicing these virtues on a day-to-day basis. Thanks for watching. God bless you.